Good afternoon. I'm Doug Carlberg. I'm the chairman of the San Antonio Manufacturers Association. We're the oldest manufacturing association in the state of Texas. We've been around for 110 years. I'm also the president of Carlberg Consulting Group, and I also run a manufacturing company called M2 Global Technology. Today, I'm very excited because I've got an old friend here, Mark Graban. Mark and I go back probably 25 plus years, if not more. I can remember when I first met you through Richard Lobowitz, and at the time it was Factory Logic. We were developing software to manage the supply chain, and since then we've both been on the lean journey together, and have learned a lot from each other. And we constantly are bumping heads with each other over the years, you ended up in San Antonio for a while, so we even got a chance to spend more time. So tell me a little bit about how you get involved in lean, and because right now you're one of the leading experts. So how did you get all those in your toolbox?
Well, you're too kind, and it's good to cross paths with you here. I think we've been bumping into each other more than bumping heads. I don't think we're disagreeing.
I don't think we ever bumped heads. No, we probably helped each other out a lot.
Yeah, but yeah, we met a long time ago. I had dark hair. Back then
I had hair.
A lot of time has passed, and I mean, how did I get started with lean? On one level, I studied industrial engineering undergrad at Northwestern University.
Great school.
And I enjoyed it there. I loved it at Northwestern. And there was a class on kind of an intro to operations and production management. So what we learned about lean in the class, I would say, was accurate, but it was just a thin slice of what lean is really all about, right? So we learned, for example, why a pull-based production system could outperform one that was push-based, and why you needed to limit WIP within systems, and how a lean execution system could outperform MRP anytime, right? So we learned those lessons that were helpful. But that class wasn't covering either kind of a broader set of lean methods, and it certainly wasn't covering the management system and the culture and the philosophy of lean. So that was a good basis. But then when I started my career at General Motors, that was such a contrast. I was there for 2 years in between undergrad and grad school. It felt like 10 years in a way. But there were a lot of experiences because I saw a difference between the first year I was there, was under a plant manager who was the very traditional GM, autocratic, imperial corner office leader who didn't leave that corner office very often, compared to the second year when I worked under a plant manager who did have that experience.
Big difference in management style.
Big difference in management style. And I had other coaches that were working with me, even in that first year. I think we'll end up coming back to talk about this GM plant. This was almost 30 years ago now. General Motors Powertrain. I was working at an engine plant in Michigan. Headquarters hired people, like we had 6 or 7 people in our factory of 800 people. There was this density of people they hired in from Toyota suppliers. One guy came from Nissan. And the famous words of, "We're here from headquarters, we've been sent to help." Well, the plant manager didn't want their help. Like, he was happy for them to go just sit somewhere and play cards or color in a coloring book all day or something. So they had time and interest in coaching somebody like me, who was young and impressionable, and I could realize, that old GM system was not the way for any factory to be successful. So we spent a lot of time in the shop floor, and it wasn't hard to find waste. It wasn't hard to find problems. And what these mentors could do would, they could talk to me about how it was different at their old company. Then I think more importantly, how it could be different at GM if we were kind of set loose to do some of these things that they knew were successful, and that was lean.
I saw some of that too. I don't know if I've ever told you, but I worked for General Motors' owned Hughes Aircraft Company, and I got recruited out of General Electric Company to come in to head up their modernization program on the AMRAAM missile. And I had a chance to visit that plant that you were in, and I know exactly what you're talking about.
What year was that?
back in the 80s.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I got there in 1995.
So yeah, it needed a little bit of work, compared to where we were because at Hughes it was a winner take all on this contract, so they had to embrace lean. That was one of their strategies to be forward. So go ahead, talk a little bit more. What happened after General Motors?
In terms of my career.
Yeah, your career.
Yeah.
I'm just reinforcing what you were working with.
Yeah.
You had a lot of low-hanging fruit there, I can tell you.
Yeah. And that was a great learning, and I think we'll end up coming back to that. One of those mentors at GM had graduated from a dual degree program at MIT called Leaders for Manufacturing.
Well, that's a great program.
And it was a dual degree engineering and MBA program. I wanted to go back and do an MBA, and I wanted to do an operations-focused MBA, but I probably would have considered, let's say, University of Michigan or maybe going back to Northwestern. MIT wouldn't have been on my radar. And Steve Chong was his name. He was incredibly encouraging and, for one, told me about the program, and he thought it would be that I would be a perfect fit for it. And then, thankfully, I was able to get the test scores and recommendations to get in. So that was a great education. And there was a deeper dive there, learning about lean from the engineering perspective, more of the kind of technical aspects of cell design and inventory management and things, again, kind of focused on inventory and production planning, but also had a chance to meet Jim Womack for the first time.
Oh, Jim's great. A great mentor.
We invited Jim to come in and speak. The book Lean Thinking had only been out a year or so at that point.
And The Machine That Changed the World. A lot of great books.
Yeah, so there was an opportunity to start learning more about the management and culture sides of lean. And then as my career's progressed, I've been really fortunate to work with a lot of former Toyota people, consulting alongside them and learning a lot about lean from people at Honeywell. That was the last manufacturing company that I worked for, 2004 to 2005. And then my career kind of took a turn into healthcare, doing consulting work for hospitals and health systems.
And you've written a number of books on healthcare, haven't you? I mean, I kind of lost track. It's got to be at least 5, if not more.
It should be easier for me to count it. But so there was a book, Lean Hospitals, that has 3 editions. So I don't know how we want to count that.
I counted it as 1.
Yeah, that's how I would count it too. 1 book with 3 editions. 2 books that I co-authored with Joe Schwartz. One was called Healthcare Kaizen. And then we did a separate version of that called The Executive Guide to Healthcare Kaizen. I was the ringleader and editor and publisher of a book called Practicing Lean, where I wrote 2 chapters to try to tee it up and set the tone, and 15 other people invited my offer to write a chapter of their own. And then in the past 6 years, I've written and published 2 books that were, again, my own solo writing. One of those is called Measures of Success. And then last year, my most recent book is called The Mistakes That Make Us.
Oh, yeah, I just saw that release here just recently. FYI, back when you applied for the Shingo Prize for Lean Hospitals, I led the team to do the book review. Oh. So it's a small world how we kind of interconnect over the years.
Yeah. Thank you.
So tell me about, because I know when you were here in San Antonio, you formed kind of a user group from all the regional hospitals here and really were getting them really exposed to lean, which was a pretty amazing transformation back then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in a couple different cities when we've lived up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area previously, I had organized kind of an informal group. It wasn't even a formal organization. It was just a Lean DFW networking group, which was sort of based upon something I got to experience when we lived in Phoenix. Going back 20 years ago, there was a similar group for people from different manufacturing companies. Nobody was competing with each other. So we could get together once a quarter and take turns hosting, come visit our facility, talk about lean, talk about our challenges, have fresh eyes coming in and looking at things. In San Antonio, that group was a little bit different. It was healthcare focused, and it was more of an opportunity to meet up and talk. It wasn't quite the same as going and doing the factory visits like we had been doing in Phoenix. But interest in lean at that point was already growing. Different health systems here in San Antonio were certainly headed down that path already. But opportunities for the civilian hospitals and the San Antonio Medical Center, Military Medical Center, SAMC. There are opportunities for that networking to bridge from the defense and military side to civilian private sector healthcare. So I'm a big advocate for organizations learning from each other, even when you might say on some level these hospitals, the ones in the private sector, were competing against each other. These hospitals can and should be comparing notes on things that would improve patient safety and the quality of care. They're all part of the community. And even though, sure, they're competing, they really need to be helping each other out. And sharing their lessons learned about lean and quality improvement and safety improvement was one way to help accomplish that.
And I know your books would really have an impact. I mean, it's a lot of hospitals that's required reading, for people coming in. Yeah. You've got a couple podcasts yourself.
Right.
One of the ones I kind of like is it's titled My Favorite Mistakes.
Let's talk about the ones you don't like. No,
yeah.
No, the one, My Favorite Mistake is a podcast that I started in September 2020. I'm glad you like it. I think
I do like it. I do like it. Well, I like the lean one too, but a lot of people do lean ones,
Sure.
But you learn from your mistakes, That's what it's.
And I made a mistake by being a smart aleck because you were being nice. And this is what happens when people know each other for a while.
We go back a long time, Mark.
So forgive me for that. But the podcast, My Favorite Mistake, is something I started September 2020. It was kind of a pandemic project because I wasn't able to continue the work traveling, to work with hospitals. And so it's a podcast that's meant to celebrate the learning and the growth that can come from a mistake. So each guest gets to decide, it's what's their favorite mistake or a favorite mistake that they're willing to tell a story about in a podcast. I'm very intentionally not asking, what was your biggest mistake? Like that just might be kind of sad.
It's really kind of pushing the envelope.
Difficult. No, sometimes people will answer that question of what's their favorite mistake, and it's a whopper. I mean, it might be their biggest mistake, or maybe not. But what we try to draw out from people on the podcast is reinforcing a couple themes of one, everybody makes mistakes, even people who have reached the top of their profession, whether that's in business or in sports or in politics. And I think it sets a great example when people are willing and able to admit a mistake and not to beat themselves up, but to talk about what they learned, how it maybe opened a door that wouldn't have presented itself, or I think it's great when people tell a story about how they learned to not repeat that mistake. People had their first business fail, they learned from it, they tried again and succeeded. Those are the types of stories that I love trying to bring to people on the podcast.
It's done. And let's talk a little bit about your other podcast, your lean podcast, because I was looking at the library of that thing. It is unbelievable. You've talked and interviewed some of the greatest lean leaders here in North America.
Well, it's been more than 500 episodes.
That's what I was saying. I was just going through it. I'm going, wow.
And I'm going to put you on the spot. I don't know why you haven't been a guest on my podcast, but we're going to return the favor here now soon, I hope. I've talked to you about being on the podcast.
You have, and we just haven't been able to connect. So the question is, do I get the lean podcast or I get the mistake podcast?
You could do, some people do both.
Who knows? Who knows?
It's a different discussion on each.
Trust me, I have made a lot of mistakes in my career. That's for sure.
But the first podcast that I started back in 2006, I call it Lean Blog Interviews, basically. It was extension of the blog that I had started in 2005. I've been really fortunate to interview. I mean, the podcast started because of Norman Bodak.
Yeah.
I had a chance to know Norm. It was his idea.
Was it really?
Yeah.
I mean, it was sad that he passed away a couple of years ago during COVID, but he did a lot initiating lean in this country, let me tell you.
And he was very tech savvy. I learned about Zoom through Norman Boda.
You're kidding me.
Because, he was getting up there, it was late 70s, early 80s. And
yeah.
he discovered Zoom and he's like, I can train and teach people all around the world from home. Zoom wasn't the first video conferencing technology, but it was so easy to use. And now we all know Zoom. But Norman, I got to know him, and we had done, because I had the blog, and emailed back and forth Q&A. So I would send him questions, he would type answers, I would publish them on the blog. And Norman actually had the idea. You could say an idea is a gift. He gave me the gift. He said to me one day, I think we were on the phone, that's why I can really remember him saying it, but he said, Mark, you should do a radio interview with me. And I thought, well, I don't own a radio station, Norman. I don't have a radio show. But there's this new thing called podcasting. Let's try. So he was pretty good with Skype. That's what we were using at the time. And I don't know if I would have started the podcast without that idea and that encouragement. And look, this happens with Kaizen ideas in the workplace. Sometimes that first idea isn't really something you can implement, but it's the spark to start brainstorming and say, well, what could we do? So I'll be, I think, forever grateful to Norman.
I am too, because I've learned a lot from him. And I'm glad I nominated him for the Association for Manufacturing Hall of Fame the year before he passed away.
Yeah,
I'm sure glad he got that honor before he really passed away. I've got 3 questions for you real quick. Can you share a story in your past that had a profound impact on your leadership style?
So I'm going to go, so this is going to bring the story back to General Motors. And, just to compare and contrast a little bit more, that first year I was there, very traditional plant manager, and the number 2 in command, and I use that word in command intentionally, it was command and control leadership. The number 2 guy in the plant superintendent, he was more the henchman that would go out into the factory and glare and yell at people, and and the plant manager was kind of above it all, I guess. But it was just a really sad environment, whether hourly workers or salaried workers. There was just this cloud over everybody's heads. Like people just didn't enjoy being there. Now, the UAW employees all had 35 years of experience. They were locked in.
A tough nut to crack.
They were just waiting for their retirement and their pension. Salaried workforce, depending on how long they had been there, maybe in the same camp. But it's just the productivity and quality were terrible. As an industrial engineer, we were given benchmarks of productivity, especially from other plants, and we were really the bottom of the barrel, just factual data-driven statement. But the environment and the culture there, like nowadays people might say it was a toxic workplace because, we didn't use that language then, but there'd be big quality problems. There would be spills that would reach the assembly plant. And we were making premium V8 engines for Cadillacs and an Oldsmobile model. These were expensive engines that were designed to be high quality and high performance. And they were, except when they didn't work. And the percentage that didn't work was shockingly high. The quality problems that we would find within our plant, the quality problems that would reach the assembly plant, the quality problems that would reach the customer. And I mean, I'm not talking, I didn't get the mileage that you promised me. It was more like the engine blew up under someone's hood in the first 100 miles of driving.
Not a good thing.
That might be the last Cadillac
they're going to buy.
People bought.
Yeah.
And there were all kinds of other problems with Cadillac's business at the time. So I started to see, the problem was not the workers. Like if you go back to Dr. Deming or anyone else talking about how people want to do good work, that was true of the UAW workforce. And I think they'd just been so beaten down over decades. You might look and say they seem bitter. Some of them seem lazy. Some of them did sleep during the day because they were monitoring automated machining equipment. This wasn't hands-on assembly work. Well, how do you think they got to be that way?
We didn't engage them. You didn't empower.
They hadn't been engaged.
They haven't been empowered.
And then I think the most dysfunctional thing was that management would continually make decisions that would prioritize quantity and production schedule
Over quality.
Including, telling workers, no, you can't stop the line to pull an engine block off to do the quality gauging. You got to keep it running. And then when the bleep hit the fan, the workers would get blamed for not caring about quality. It was insane. And after a couple of major quality spills to the Cadillac plant, the plant manager got promoted to headquarters. They were going to let him ride it out to retirement up there, I guess. And they brought in a new plant manager who had been a GM person who was one of the original group that had been sent to California
For NUMMI?
at NUMMI to
wow.
learn from Toyota.
Wow.
And so he had that NUMMI experience. Some of those original, they were dubbed the NUMMI Commandos.
Interesting.
I think the Wall Street Journal or some other publication that wrote about this group. I've talked to another one who left GM because he didn't see any hope of taking those learnings from NUMMI into other factories. So he gave up and left to go be a consultant. That guy, Steve. Larry Spiegel, who was the second plant manager I work under, he stuck it out, right? He I think knew it was going to be difficult, but I think he was up for that fight. Steve went on to take on that fight in other industries and did a lot to help other companies. But Larry stayed within GM. He had turned around the transmission plant near Detroit. So he was brought in now to change this bigger plant that was even more troubled. And so what I saw from Larry Spiegel, in no particular order, he was out in the factory floor as much as I was, if not more. And I was an industrial engineer whose job it was to be out there a lot. So Larry was out there in the factory, which is noteworthy. But then I noticed, if you know the old expression, you've got two ears and one mouth, use them in that ratio. That was his leadership style. He was out there listening. I know he was probably hearing a lot of complaints, and I'm sure he knew what complaints he was going to hear. But he heard people out, even if he was hearing the same stuff from everybody. I remember talking to him once, and Larry emphasized that how important it was for him to build relationships with the frontline workers, to start building trust, that they could trust him, that A, he cared, and B, that he kind of knew what he was doing and he was worth following. So then under that plant manager, it's not like it changed everything overnight, but he set that tone of putting quality and safety first. There were different quality projects that I had been stonewalled on, or safety projects is what I meant to say. Safety projects that I had identified and wanted to work on where I was getting stonewalled. It was never a priority. I couldn't get maintenance time. Under a different plant manager, those things got approved and started getting done. And that team of those lean people who had been hired from other companies were actually now being put to work to help improve different departments and to try to teach and coach people and drive improvements. And then I think the most impactful thing, kind of the final thing that comes to mind, was Larry at an all-hands meeting, hourly, salaried, probably the first shift. So probably 500 of the 800 people in that plant were all in that room, crammed in. And Larry, for one, kind of presented the data around how bad our performance was on productivity and quality. But he said, things are going to get better, right? So we could address the hard truths of like, we need to change, we need to improve. Like the future of this factory is on the line. But he also said the era of blaming the workers is over.
Which was key. He made a lot of points by saying that.
He said together, we are going to improve, not because the workers are going to work, differently. I mean, it's generalizing, right? But he said the problem, the need was the opportunity to manage differently. But that was the key, right? Before it was us versus them. He said, together, we are going to do this. And I saw a lot of improvement happening in my first year there. And then when I was gone at MIT, I kept in touch with people. And that plant went from being the bottom of the barrel to being up in the top quartile within a couple of years. So it was kind of a different version of that NUMMI story. Same workers, different management style, big difference.
I think John Shook came out of that factory, if I remember correctly.
Yes, he was at NUMMI.
He was at NUMMI, and he wrote the book Going to Sea. So here, if you're listening to this, if you haven't read John's book, I'd recommend buying it and reading it. Yeah. It's all about going to sea to the factory floor.
Yeah, John was the first American hired by Toyota, and he helped bring the Toyota production system to the U.S., not just translating the language, but translating the practices.
And I've known John for years. He's just a wealth of knowledge. I just wrote, much like you, has written multiple books on the topic.
Well, I've learned a lot from John.
Yeah, so have I. Next question. What have been your greatest failures, and what do you learn from them?
So I'm trying to think. That's a little bit different question than I ask people on the podcast. Greatest failure. Well, I'm gonna tell a story if I can. I'm gonna frame it as a mistake.
Okay.
So if I were to answer my own question, because I think mistakes can lead to failures. Those words aren't synonyms, but I'm going to tell a mistake story that led to a failure. Some of that was on me, and I'll kind of tell that story. So when I was at Honeywell, 2004 was my last manufacturing job. I had that experience at GM. I had lots of education and some experience with Lean, including at that company, Factory Logic, that you mentioned, software company with some services. And I learned from a lot of people there. And when I was at Honeywell, they wanted me to go through their basically Lean black belt program. Okay, well, great. I don't know it all. I can learn more, and this is part of the job. I'll go through that. So it was 4 weeks of training, and the instructors, who were basically like the master black belts with Lean, in talking with them, they realized I had knowledge and experience. They let me teach parts of the course, like as part of development.
Well, that's a great way to learn
for me, and a great way to reinforce learning. So I'm going through that program, and you had to do a project to get certified, which was a great opportunity, and it was kind of in line with what my job was anyway. So I was given the assignment to work with the production department that was very behind in its production. They were causing assembly delays because of the lack of components that were being built in this one department with like 6 or 7 different machines. And it could have flowed almost single piece flow, but there were, you can imagine this, Doug, I'm sure, big carts full of inventory. But with all the inventory in the room, very little was actually making it through the entire process. Because
it might have been going through the rework loop, but anyway.
Well, quality problems. So they would make a lot of stuff that would end up being defective. Certain machines would break down a lot because they were old machine. They were being held together by chewing gum and duct tape, almost literally. And so I had this job and this challenge of trying to help improve flow. So one of the things to do that was to reduce setup times on a couple of the initial presses so that we could run smaller batches, which would improve the flow. And we were always so behind on one product and we had too much of another. So it was kind of screaming for reducing batch sizes, which requires reducing setup time. So we did some of that work, and that wasn't a mistake. What was a mistake was then from the reduced setup times and the smaller batches and kind of creating an internal supermarket that was going to be driven by visual management and Kanban cards. And like, it was all technically correct. The math was correct. Like, I have no doubt of any of that. Put the system in place, laminated Kanban cards and visual management, and nobody ever used it. They kept running the batch sizes they wanted to run because, you know what? I wasn't their boss. I couldn't tell them what to do. I couldn't get the production manager for that area to push people to do things differently. But my mistake, that was partially mine, was not doing more to engage people throughout the process of creating that system. I was trying to sell it to them after the fact.
That's a big difference.
I learned that that's too late. Now, I think, to be fair to myself, that culture that I was working in was not a culture of stopping production to engage the frontline staff. So I was swimming upstream on that. But I also knew this was likely not going to be super successful because of that engagement. And I think my mistake was not pushing to say to management, look, if you want this problem to be solved, everything the company's been doing up to this point hasn't been solving it. We've got to try something different. And I need your support to go spend more time with the frontline workers and that frontline manager. So it's not this geek from upstairs being brought in to try to solve it for you.
Do you think part of the problem was the measurement criteria that was on the supervisors and the boss for that area?
I think that was part of it. I think more of it was just cultural, of just thinking that the problem couldn't be solved, so it was just bound to go on. I see a lot of in healthcare. This shows like this dismissiveness where people either say, "Oh, that problem's not that bad," or it must not be solvable because we haven't solved it already. And then it can be embarrassing if you come in now with something that could be a solution. So I think there's some psychology like that was involved. But the one key takeaway for me now as a consultant is that I don't want to be I'm not going to allow myself to be put in that position again of a company saying, "Hey, Mark, come in and fix it for us."
I mean, let me tell you, there's a big difference between being in a company or a hospital and bringing in a consultant that you're paying for. You probably have the same information internally. You just don't want to listen to it. So you've got the advantage coming in from the outside, clean set of eyes, and I see that.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons I love doing these shingle audits and Association for Manufacturing Excellence. When I go in there, I love giving people feedback, and then coming back and see that they implemented it.
Yeah.
But where did I get half the information? From the employees we talked to.
Yeah.
If they just open up and listen to the team.
And there's risk that and I've been in situations where they don't want to listen to the outside consultant either. Yeah. And so I would want to not repeat that same experience because it's frustrating for me and it doesn't really help the organization.
Understand. My last question is, what do you think your biggest misconception is on people have about leadership?
It's a really interesting question. Here's the one that comes to mind. I think there's a misconception where leaders think they need to give people incentives to do things that they naturally want to be doing. So organizations will provide incentives or set a target or a goal around how many improvement ideas you need to implement. I mean, going back to GM or other settings, people would roll their eyes and say, like, I've been trying to speak up for a really long time and you didn't listen. No thanks. Like people say, okay, now you're offering me $20 for an idea. Like I can live without that. Incentivizing people to focus on quality or safety. Like, of course they want to focus on safety. Who doesn't want to prioritize their own safety given a choice? And people take pride in their work and they want to do quality work. And so I think there's a cycle that we have to break. And I think companies that get down the lean pathway can break this cycle of instead of having to bribe people to do the things they naturally want to do, you need to create an environment where you can get out of their way and start listening and prove that it's going to be different. And I think you can focus on engagement more than incentives. And then I think when people talk about incentives, they'll use the phrase rewards and recognition. And the word rewards comes first. I think you can flip those. I think recognition means a lot to people. I'm not saying never reward them, but I think the management misconception is that it always comes back to money and incentives.
Not always.
I don't think it does.
And one of the companies that does that best that I've ever been to is O.C. Tanner in Salt Lake City. Yeah. And it's all about recognition with their employees, and they have got a dynamic team. And because they're in Salt Lake, it's interesting in themselves. They've got so many with the way they're set up there with the Mormon Church. Mm-hmm. They have got, it's like a little United Nations. You go into a cell and they maybe have 15 different countries in there, mm-hmm. and the way they're all working together is just amazing. But it comes down to recognition and engagement in the people. Mm-hmm. So if anybody ever gets a chance to do a tour at OC Tanner, I really would recommend it.
Yeah. And then I want to give a shout out to Joe Schwartz and his organization, the Franciscan St. Francis Health System in Indiana. They've implemented over time, and I don't have data from the last couple of years, well over 50,000 employee ideas.
Oh, wow.
And it's really about tapping into people's intrinsic motivation. Like the extrinsic rewards they give tend to be very small. But I think there's a great lesson there and other health systems that are engaging people at that scale. Get out of people's way instead of feeling like you have to force them to do it. And then recognition really does mean a lot to people. I think that's true even outside of healthcare. Great.
Hey, Mark, I want to thank you for coming today. This has been a great talk. I mean, it's just amazing some of the stuff you've done over the years. Here again, I want to thank you from the San Antonio Manufacturers Association podcast, Manufacturing Matters. And I'm looking to talking to you and being on your podcast. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you, Doug. And I look forward, we'll continue the conversation on one or both of those other podcasts.
You got it. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug.